Welcome to another video. In this one, we'll be learning how to analyze theses, claims, and evidence. In this video, we will discuss how to identify theses and claims, distinguish between the different types of evidence, and analyze how writers develop their own claims. To begin, an overarching thesis is the author's main idea, which they support through additional claims. In essence, the thesis is the big idea or argument that the writer is making. The claims are statements that support that idea. Here's an example. Now, there are a few ways to categorize thesis statements, starting with if it's open or closed. An open thesis will present an argument without previewing any of the main claims, whereas a closed thesis will specifically address the main claims that are going to be made in the paper. If you look at the example on the screen, the open thesis simply states, "I like strawberry ice cream." This is still defensible and it's still an argument, but it hasn't previewed any of the reasons why. The closed example does have reasons, including that the person likes fresh fruit. The advantage for one over the other varies, but one advantage to an open thesis is that it does allow for a little bit of flexibility as you start writing. Another way that thesis statements can be categorized is if they're implicit or explicit. While an explicit thesis is going to be stated directly in the passage or text, an implicit thesis won't. Instead, it's something that you need to determine based on an inference. Now, most professional writers usually tend to go more towards implicit or implied thesis statements, whereas academically, we always use an explicit thesis, and on your AP exam, you'll definitely want that explicit thesis statement. Your AP multiple choice exam will ask that you identify the thesis in various passages. Here are some tips to help you be successful. First of all, like we just talked about, a thesis might not always be explicitly stated in the passage. It might be instead implicit. For this reason, it's so important that you read the entire passage before you answer any questions about thesis statements. Second tip is that a thesis statement is not always a single sentence. It could be one, two, and even some professional writers will spend multiple sentences establishing what their thesis is. Third piece of advice, make sure that you are looking throughout the text for a thesis. It's not always going to be at the very beginning. While in academic writing, we do tend to see the thesis in the introduction, professional writers can often place it throughout a passage. So make sure you're not limiting yourself to just the beginning. The best way that I think to identify a thesis is to read through the passage and think about how you would summarize it in a sentence or two. If you can find a sentence in the passage that's similar to that summary, that's going to be your thesis, or that's your implicit thesis. Let's stop to practice with a very short text, a YouTube short. Pause this video and visit the link in the description titled TED Shorts, How AI Could Save, Not Destroy Education. Listen to the short carefully, then in your notes identify his thesis. And remember, it might be implicit and not directly stated. Well, what did you think? The first hint was that it is not an example of an explicit thesis. Instead, it's implicit. He is making the implicit claim that AI can actually help education. We know this for a few reasons. First off, he starts by talking about the negative narrative surrounding AI and education. Then in response to this, he shows how the app can actually assist a student writer. By using these kind of two pieces of evidence or observations, he's able to refute the idea that AI is negative for education and instead show that it is going to improve education. All right, let's have our first solo practice. Go ahead and pause the video again and find the link in the description titled Sally Ride. This is a speech by the first female astronaut. In your notes, identify what you think her thesis is. Then state if it is implicit or explicit, and if it is open or closed. Sometimes there's a little confusion surrounding the difference between a thesis and a claim. Essentially, a thesis is just a type of claim. Here is the main difference. A text is only going to have one thesis or overarching claim, but it's going to have multiple claims supporting that overarching thesis. To identify claims, it helps to look for chunks in the text or sections that develop a single idea. If you can separate the text into these pieces, you're identifying the different claims being made and the line of reasoning. Let's practice identifying claims together. On the next page, I've provided an excerpt from an article by Neil deGrasse Tyson, an astrophysicist. I have bolded a possible thesis for you. Can you identify a supporting claim? All right, let's talk through this one. I chose this article intentionally because the first supporting claim can be very challenging to identify. I've bolded it on the screen. If the thesis is that science is fundamental to our country, or it should be fundamental to our country, the first supporting claim might be surprising to you because it feels like it's saying the opposite. In the blue text, it says that we've moved away from science, that we've lost our ability to trust what scientists are telling us. This seems like the direct opposite of what his thesis is. But I picked this text because I wanted to show you an example of what's called a qualified claim. A qualified claim is kind of accepting that there are limitations to something. In this case, it's Tyson's observation that we have a problem, which is that we no longer trust scientists. He supports this claim with examples like climate change and vaccinations, both which have received resistance in recent years. This is a great example of a method of development called problem solution. This first chunk, what's appearing on the screen to you, establishes that we have a problem currently. What you can't see is that the rest of the article goes on to express the solution. This is a way of identifying claims where, like I said, you pick out a chunk. If you were to read everything from the blue sentence to the end of the screen, that chunk is establishing the claim that we have lost that fundamental reliance on science. For a little bit more practice, take a second to read the rest of Tyson's article. It's linked in the description as Neil deGrasse Tyson. See if you can identify those consequent claims he makes about why science should be fundamental and the solutions he sees. All right, let's take a quick exam break to talk about where this skill is going to appear in your AP exam. First of all, as I mentioned previously, there will be multiple choice questions that ask you about the thesis, the evidence, and the claims that a writer makes in the different passages. Another place where this would be helpful, though, is in question 1 of the free response or essay questions. Question 1 provides you a series of sources. It's important that as you read them, you're able to identify the thesis that these authors are making, the claims that they're making, as well as evidence provided, because those are the same resources that you'll have to write an essay of your own. Now, writers use a wide range of different types of evidence. The more effective the writer, the wider range of evidence they use. And each different type of evidence can serve a different function of the rhetorical situation. Let me give you an example. To reveal more about themselves as a speaker, a writer might use a personal anecdote, which is an experience from their own life or a story that they'd like to share. Similarly, they might use a story like that to show what motivated them to be interested in the subject. It might also reveal their exigence, or why they thought it was important to write the text to begin with. Now let's talk about the function of these different types of evidence. While the primary function of evidence is to support a claim, there are 4 different ways that evidence can do that. It can illustrate, amplify, associate, or clarify. All right, let's practice together. On the screen, I've provided you the first part of a body paragraph, including the claim, which is in black, and the evidence, which is in blue. As I read through this small portion, see if you can identify what type of evidence is being used, as well as the function of that evidence. Let's go through it together. A systemic approach by police will make it possible to outlaw and therefore minimize texting and driving. For instance, consider the increase in seatbelt use. In 1991, it became compulsory to wear a seatbelt. Beginning with a period in which they handed out warnings, they eventually graduated to citations. Today, seatbelt use has never been higher. Take a second to see if you can identify what type of evidence and what function this evidence is serving. Let's start by talking about the type of evidence being used. This is an example of an analogy or a comparison. In particular, it's comparing a previous problem, which was poor seatbelt use, to a current problem, which is texting and driving. The function of this analogy is to associate those 2 problems to show how one was resolved and how the same thing can be applied to the current problem. Let me explain. The claim is arguing that a systemic approach by police will help minimize or outlaw, get rid of texting and driving. The evidence then is associating that problem with seatbelts, where police did use a systemic approach, graduating from the warnings to the citations. It's arguing and associating the 2 to show that problem was resolved with a systemic approach, and the same can be applied to texting and driving. Let's do another solo practice. On the next slide, you'll see 2 more claims and 2 more pieces of evidence. See if you can do what we just did. Identify the type as well as the function in your notes. Thank you so much for watching as we learned how to analyze theses, claims, and evidence. On the next slide, there are 3 review questions on things that we've covered in this video. Take a moment and answer them in your notes. I'll see you next time.